My name is Clara Whitcomb, and I was 36 years old when my family laughed at my job in the middle of my brother's wedding reception. It happened at a lakeside resort in Traverse City, Michigan. Under white string lights and a ceiling full of flowers Elodie Mercer's family had probably paid more for than I made in 3 months. The room smelled like champagne, gardenias, and money that had learned not to introduce itself too loudly. My brother Bennett stood in the center of it all, one hand around his bride's waist, the other holding a glass. He kept lifting like the whole night had been built to toast him. Maybe it had. I was standing near the bar with a glass of water when Bennett spotted me. His smile changed when he saw me. Not warmer, sharper, useful. He crossed the room, put his hand on my shoulder, and guided me toward the VIP table where Dr. Rosalind Mercer, Elodie's mother, was speaking with 2 investors. "Dr. Mercer," Bennett said, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear, "you have to meet my sister. This is Clara. She washes surgical tools for a living." A few people laughed. Not cruelly at first, politely. The way people laugh when they are told something is supposed to be funny. Then my mother, Marjorie, tilted her champagne glass and added, "We love Clara, of course. We just don't really brag about her. Bennett is the ambitious one." That got a bigger laugh. My father looked down at his plate. I stood there with my hands at my sides, feeling the cold from my water glass fade from my palm. I did not defend myself. I had spent too many years defending work they had never bothered to understand. But Dr. Mercer did not laugh. She set her glass down slowly, looked at me like she was reading a name on a file she remembered, and said, "Clara Whitcomb? From the Lakeshore Sterile Safety project?" And just like that, the room began to quiet. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet your phone battery is at 58% right now, right? If that's true, type 1. If not, type 2. Let's see whether I got it right. All right, enough talking. Let's begin the story. I will tell you what Dr. Mercer said after that. I will tell you how Bennett's smile slipped, how my mother's champagne glass stopped halfway to her mouth, and how my father finally looked up when the damage had already found its way into the room. But first, you need to understand what that one question did after the music started again, and everyone pretended the night could still be saved. 2 days after the wedding, ClearSuture Analytics received a formal notice from Mercer Regional Health Network. Their pilot agreement was being paused, pending documentation review. That was the phrase they used. Documentation review. Clean, professional, almost gentle. But in Bennett's world, it meant the door he had been bragging about for 6 months had just been locked from the other side. By late Tuesday afternoon, Elias Crown's office suspended the $8.6 million investment term sheet. The email did not sound angry. That was what made it worse. It cited unresolved ownership concerns, insufficient verification of proprietary process claims, and the need for additional diligence before any reconsideration. People who have never been near a business deal think disaster arrives loudly. Sometimes it arrives in a PDF attachment with a polite greeting and no exclamation points. Bennett called me 11 times that day. I did not answer, not because I wanted him to panic, and not because I was enjoying any of it. I did not answer because I had learned that spoken conversations disappeared. Documents did not. My mother called 6 times. Then she texted, "You need to call your brother before this gets worse." Not apologize, not explain, not tell the truth. Call your brother. As if the emergency was not what Bennett had done, but the fact that other people had finally noticed. My father called at 7:12 Wednesday morning. I remember the time because I was standing in my kitchen waiting for the coffee maker to finish, still wearing the gray cardigan I had slept in. His voice sounded smaller than usual, scraped down by a night without rest. "Clara," he said, "your mother and I put money into Bennett's company." I closed my eyes. "How much?" He was quiet long enough for the coffee machine to click off. 96,000. That was the first time I felt something close to pity. Not forgiveness, not softness. Just the heavy recognition that my parents had not only believed Bennett's story, they had bought stock in it. By noon, Bennett's attorney sent a cease and desist letter accusing me of interfering with ClearSuture's business relationships. I read it twice, then placed it beside the folder Silas Grant had helped me organize, because nothing I had said was unsubstantiated. It had dates, emails, drafts, signatures, payment records, and all of it led back to one summer night in 2022 when Bennett called me at 11:43 and asked me to make his company sound real. That summer night phone call from Bennett only mattered because a few months before it, I had already learned what my work could cost if I got it wrong. At Street Bridget Medical Center, sterile processing sat 2 floors below the operating rooms, past the employee cafeteria, and a corridor where the fluorescent lights hummed even when no one was speaking. People upstairs called it the basement. Some said it with affection. Some said it like an insult. But half the hospital depended on what happened down there. We tracked instruments, inspected trays, logged sterilizer cycles, flagged missing pieces, and sent everything back upstairs before the next surgeon reached for it. It was not glamorous work. It smelled like steam, disinfectant, warm metal, and coffee left too long on a burner. But it had a rhythm. After 12 years, I knew that rhythm well enough to hear when something was wrong. One Thursday evening in August, I saw it on the screen before anyone else did. A batch of orthopedic trays had cleared the tracking system too fast. The green check marks were there. The approved status was there. On the surface, everything looked ready, but the cycle number repeated where it should not have. I leaned closer, pulled the history, and felt my stomach tighten. 17 trays had been logged under the wrong sterilization cycle after a scanner misread 2 barcodes and carried forward an old entry. It was the kind of mistake that looked harmless until somebody needed to explain it afterward. I called upstairs and asked them to hold the cases assigned to those trays until I verified the records. The charge nurse sounded irritated. 10 minutes later, a surgical resident came down and asked if I understood how much money an operating room lost every minute it sat empty. I looked at him and said, "So does explaining why an instrument record is wrong after the fact." He stared at me like I had stepped outside the place he had already put me. June Marlowe came down from OR 4, hair tucked under a blue cap, eyes sharp from a shift that had already been too long. She looked at the screen, then at me, and said, "If Clara says hold them, we hold them." So we pulled every tray. We matched the physical tags against the digital logs. We found the error before the first case rolled back. The next morning, Tobias Reed walked into sterile processing in a gray suit that looked strange beside the racks and heat-sealed packaging. He stood by my workstation and said, "You did not slow this hospital down, Clara. You kept it honest." That was the first time someone with a title understood I was not just cleaning tools. I was protecting the thin line between a system looking safe and a system actually being safe. Tobias's words should have been enough for me. For a while, I told myself they were. I carried them home the way some people carry flowers, carefully, privately, without expecting anyone else to admire them. At work, they meant something. June knew what they meant. Tobias knew. After that night, safety questions started coming directly to me, not because I had a louder title, but because I had been right when being right was inconvenient. Inside the Whitcomb house, none of that followed me through the door. At Sunday dinners, Bennett was the headline before the food hit the table. My mother would start while setting down a casserole dish, as if his achievements needed to be served hot. Bennett had a new investor meeting. Bennett had been invited to a healthcare innovation breakfast. Bennett had bought a better suit because, as she put it, founders have to look the part. I would sit across from him, still smelling faintly of hospital soap no matter how long I showered, and listen while he described problems I had been solving long before he learned the words for them. He never mentioned patients. He talked about markets. He talked about disruption. He talked about scaling trust in clinical environments, a phrase I hated because trust was not something you scaled. It was something you earned, usually in rooms nobody photographed. One Sunday, the McAllisters from next door came over for dinner. They were retired, kind, the sort of people who asked questions because silence made them uncomfortable. "Mrs. McAllister turned to me while my mother sliced pie and said, "Clara, what is it you do at the hospital?" I opened my mouth. My mother answered first. "She works with surgical supplies," Marjorie said lightly. "Downstairs somewhere. It's necessary work, I suppose." Bennett smiled into his coffee. "Every family needs somebody practical." The table laughed softly, the polite kind of laugh that waits for permission from the most confident person in the room. My father did not laugh. That used to comfort me. Later, I understood it should not have. He only lowered his eyes and cut the edge of his pie with the side of his fork, careful and quiet, as if avoiding a mess counted as cleaning one up. I looked at Bennett's hands on the table, clean nails, expensive watch, no trace of the dry, cracked skin that came from gloves, steam, and hospital soap. I looked at my mother's face, bright with pride whenever his name came up, and blankly pleasant whenever mine did. That was how my family measured value. Bennett had vision. I had a shift schedule. Bennett had meetings. I had gloves. Bennett built a company. I carried a badge that smelled like hospital soap. And because I had spent years swallowing the correction, they mistook my silence for agreement. The first time Bennett understood how useful my silence could be, he did not steal from me all at once. He asked for help. It was the summer of 2022, late enough in July that the heat stayed in the walls of my apartment after dark. I had just kicked off my shoes after a 12-hour shift when my phone rang at 11:43. Bennett's name lit up the screen. He almost never called that late, unless he needed something too complicated to put in a text. When I answered, he sounded breathless, but not afraid. More irritated that reality had refused to match the version of himself he had already sold to other people. "I have a demo in 3 weeks," he said. "Healthcare investors, people who actually know the space." I sat on the edge of my bed. "What are you demoing?" There was a pause. "That's why I'm calling. ClearSuture Analytics," he explained, was supposed to be a surgical safety platform. He had a logo, a pitch deck, a landing page, and 3 advisors who liked being called advisors. What he did not have was a process model that could survive inside an actual hospital. He knew the phrases: instrument traceability, risk reduction, turnover efficiency, but he did not know where the risk lived. "I need the hospital part to hold up when real people start asking questions," he said. I should have heard the warning in that sentence. Instead, I heard my mother's voice from earlier that week, telling me Bennett was under pressure. I heard my father's text, "Help your brother if you can." And I heard the old foolish hope that maybe if I showed them the work clearly enough, they would finally understand what it was. So I helped. For 26 days, I worked my shifts, came home, showered, made coffee I did not need, and built Bennett the spine of his company. I wrote the tray tracking protocol. I mapped escalation tiers for sterilization discrepancies. I drafted the red tag alert model, the audit trail language, the staff workflow, and the patient safety rationale. I translated 12 years of hospital basement knowledge into words investors could applaud. Bennett promised $18,000 and a clinical systems co-designer credit. He paid me $2,200. The credit never appeared. 6 months later, ClearSuture's website described the model as Bennett Whitcomb's proprietary surgical safety intelligence framework. I read that sentence during a lunch break beside a vending machine that had eaten my crust for memes. Dollar. I did not scream. I did not call him. I printed everything. The agreement, the drafts, the emails, the timestamps. Because by then, I had learned something my family never respected about quiet people. Quiet does not mean empty. Sometimes quiet is where the records are kept. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet you're watching this video right now while lying down with your legs crossed, right? If that's true, type 3. If not, type 4. Let's see whether I got it right. All right. Enough talking. Let's begin the story. For a while, the record stayed in a drawer, and life went on the way life does when no one else knows a theft has occurred. I went to work. Bennett went to healthcare breakfasts with name tags and small microphones clipped to his collar. My mother posted photographs of him standing beside banners that said innovation and future of care, and every time she did, some aunt or cousin I barely knew commented, "So proud of him." I never commented. Facts did not travel well inside my family unless Bennett carried them. At Street Brigid, things were different for a little while. Tobias Reed kept his word. After the tray incident, he pulled me into meetings people in my position were usually left out of. Not enough to change my title, not enough to change my pay, but enough that when a workflow question came up, someone would say, "Ask Clara, she'll know where it breaks." That mattered more than I wanted it to. 6 months after Lakeshore went live, Tobias sent an email to the surgical leadership team. He copied me. The subject line was simple: Lakeshore Sterile Safety 180-day review. The report showed a 37% reduction in instrument documentation errors across the units using the new workflow. Not perfect. Hospitals are never perfect, but better, measurably better. At the bottom, Tobias wrote, "Primary process design and field implementation led by Clara Whitcomb." I printed that one too, not because I thought I would need it at a wedding someday. I printed it because I had spent my whole adult life watching other people rename my work after it became useful. Then, in January of 2025, Tobias was transferred to Pennsylvania to help clean up a struggling hospital network. He stopped by my station on his last afternoon with his coat over one arm and a cardboard box under the other. "Keep copies of everything," he told me. I smiled. "You know I do." His face softened. "No, Clara, I mean everything." After he left, the temperature changed. Not all at once, just enough. Questions started going through managers again. My name disappeared from meeting invites. People still came to me quietly in the hallway when something did not make sense, but the official doors closed back to their usual width. Meanwhile, Bennett got louder. He appeared on a regional healthcare podcast and used the phrase, "frontline, informed intelligence," 3 times in 20 minutes. It was a phrase I had written in a draft he never paid for. My mother sent the episode to the family chat with 3 blue hearts. "Our Bennett is saving hospitals," she wrote. I read it alone in the break room, my lunch untouched beside me, and felt something inside me go very still. No, I thought. He was selling what I had survived learning. The week before Bennett's wedding, I received an email from Silas Grant with no greeting beyond my name. Silas was an intellectual property attorney in Columbus, the kind of man who wrote like every sentence might someday be read aloud in a room where nobody liked each other. I had contacted him months earlier, after ClearSuture's website started sounding more and more like the documents I had written in my apartment. I did not ask him to sue anyone. I told him I wanted to understand what I still owned. His reply came on a Monday morning while I was eating toast over the sink before work. "Clara, I reviewed the consulting agreement again. There is no assignment clause." I read that sentence 3 times. Then I opened the attachment. Silas had marked the contract in yellow. Bennett's signature was there. Mine was there. The payment terms were there. The promise of clinical systems co-designer credit was there. But the one sentence that would have transferred ownership of my process model to ClearSuture did not exist. Bennett had been so eager to get my help, so sure I would never question him, that he had forgotten to legally take what he intended to use. Below the contract, Silas had attached my drafts, the metadata summary, and a short note that made my kitchen feel smaller. If ClearSuture is presenting this protocol as proprietary, without a signed assignment from you, this is not merely a family dispute. It is an ownership problem. I stood there with the toast cooling in my hand, feeling no triumph at all, only a strange, quiet sadness. Even then, some part of me wanted the truth to be less clear. Then I saw the 3rd attachment. Mercer Regional Health Network Lakeshore Sterile Safety Audit, 2023. I almost did not open it. I knew the report existed. Tobias had mentioned an outside board review after the project's first-year numbers came in, but I had never seen the final copy. The document loaded slowly. Hospital seal, review committee names, implementation summary, risk findings, corrective actions. Then, on the last page, a signature line. Dr. Rosalind Mercer. My eyes moved to the paragraph above it. Primary process design attributed to Clara Whitcomb. Implementation prevented systemic exposure across multiple surgical sites. I sat down on the kitchen floor because the chair was too far away. The bride's mother had not just heard of the project. She had signed the audit that named me. She knew, in writing, what my own family had spent years reducing to surgical supplies downstairs. I called Silas from the floor. "Do I tell Bennett?" I asked. "No," he said. "Do not warn him. If he describes the product publicly, let him use his own words first." So I did nothing. Not because I was scared. Because for once, silence was not protecting Bennett. It was protecting the record. Doing nothing lasted until my family began mistaking it, again, for obedience. 3 days before the wedding, my mother called while I was folding scrubs on top of my dryer. I almost let it go to voicemail, but habit is a stubborn thing, especially when it has been trained into you since childhood. "Clara," she said, without asking if I was busy. "I need to go over expectations for the weekend. Not plans, not travel details. Expectations. Elodie's family is very established," she continued. "Doctors, board members, donors. People like that notice things. So please wear something appropriate. Don't bring up hospital stories. And if anyone asks what you do, just keep it simple." I looked at the stack of clean scrubs in front of me, folded in neat gray squares. "Simple, how?" There was a small pause. "You know, don't make it technical. Bennett has a lot riding on this." There it was. The sentence my family had used in one form or another my entire adult life. Bennett has a lot riding on this. Bennett is under pressure. Bennett needs support. As if my role in the family had never been daughter or sister, only shock absorber. An hour later, Bennett texted me directly. "Be there by 5 Friday. Rehearsal dinner starts at 6. Don't talk about sterile processing with Elodie's family. They're upper-level healthcare people. They won't understand your side of it." I stared at the message longer than it deserved. They won't understand. Dr. Rosalind Mercer had signed an audit, naming me as the primary process designer, but Bennett did not know that. My mother did not know that. To them, knowledge only counted when it made Bennett taller. I typed 3 different replies and deleted all of them. Then I sent one word. "Okay." The rehearsal dinner was held Friday night in a glass-walled room overlooking Grand Traverse Bay. Everything was pale wood, white linen, and candles floating in shallow bowls of water. The kind of room designed to make wealth look tasteful instead of loud. My place card was near the service doors, between a cousin from Ohio who called me Claire twice, and one of Bennett's college friends who spent most of dinner showing people pictures of his boat. Bennett and Elodie sat near the center with Rosalind and the investors. My parents were close enough to the important table to feel included. Mallory Pike, Elodie's maid of honor, and Bennett's new favorite public relations helper, stopped by after the salad course. She looked at my name card, then at me. "Oh, you're the tool lady," she said, smiling like she had discovered a harmless little joke. A few people chuckled. I placed my napkin back in my lap and smiled politely. I had spent years trying to make people understand my work. That night, I finally understood something else. I did not need to explain myself to people who needed me small. After the rehearsal dinner, I went back to my hotel room with a headache sitting behind my eyes and the taste of unsaid things in my mouth. My room was on the 4th floor, facing Grand Traverse Bay. From the window, the water looked almost black, with little pieces of light trembling across it from the dock below. Somewhere on the lawn, people were still laughing, the kind of laughter that carries better at night, because nothing else is brave enough to compete with it. I took off my shoes by the door and stood there for a moment in my stocking feet, listening to the air conditioner click on and off. My dress was still zipped, my hair still pinned. I looked like someone who had attended a family celebration. I felt like someone who had sat through a rehearsal for her own disappearance. On the small desk beside the window, I opened my laptop. One by one, I pulled up the files Silas had helped me organize. The consulting agreement from 2022. Bennett's promise of $18,000 and co-designer credit. The payment record showing $2,200. The first tray tracking protocol draft. The red tag escalation model. The metadata summary. Tobias Reed's 180-day review. The Mercer audit with Dr. Rosalind Mercer's signature at the bottom. I did not open them because I wanted to use them. I opened them because after a night of being called the tool lady by a woman who did not know enough to be ashamed, I needed to remind myself that reality still existed somewhere in writing. For years, my family had treated truth like something negotiable. If Bennett said he built it, then he built it. If my mother said I was being sensitive, then I was sensitive. If my father stayed silent, then silence became the family record. But documents had no interest in keeping peace. They sat there, plain and stubborn, with dates attached. I composed an email to Silas. I attached the folder, even though he already had most of it. I added the rehearsal dinner text from Bennett, the one telling me not to discuss sterile processing with Elodie's family. Then I wrote one sentence. If I am asked directly, I will not lie. I stared at it for a long time before I hit send. Outside, the bay moved in the dark. Inside, my phone buzzed once. A message from my mother. Remember, tomorrow is Bennett's day. Please don't make anything awkward. I set the phone face down on the desk. For the first time in years, I did not feel the need to answer. Not because I had nothing to say, but because everything important had already been saved. The next morning, I woke before my alarm and watched the bay turn from black to silver. For a few minutes, I let myself pretend I was only a guest at a wedding. A woman in a hotel room, ironing the hem of a navy dress, pinning back her hair, checking the weather because the ceremony was outdoors, and October in Michigan could change its mind without warning. Down on the lawn, staff were already moving chairs into rows facing the water. White flowers were being tied to the aisle. Someone tested a microphone, and the sound cracked once through the morning air. By 4 o'clock, the resort had transformed itself into a photograph. The ceremony was beautiful. I can say that honestly. Elodie looked soft and nervous, and genuinely happy when she walked toward Bennett. Her mother watched her with one hand pressed lightly against her own chest. My parents sat near the front, shining with borrowed importance. Bennett cried at the right moment. He always knew when to let the room see emotion. I sat 6 rows back, between people who did not know me, and listened to my brother promise honesty, in a voice steady enough to convince anyone who had never needed honesty from him before. The reception began just after 6 in a ballroom facing the lake. Candles floated in glass bowls. A jazz trio played near the bar. The escort cards were arranged on a table covered in moss and tiny white lights. Mine placed me at table 14, near the side exit, close enough to the kitchen to hear plates being stacked behind the swinging doors. I was not surprised. From across the room, Bennett moved through the guests like he was working a room of investors, not greeting people who had come to celebrate his marriage. He shook hands, touched elbows, laughed with his head tilted back. Every few minutes, he said, ClearSuture. Every few minutes. Someone nodded as if the word itself meant future. My mother stood beside him whenever she could, adding polish to his sentences. My father stayed half a step behind them, wearing the same careful silence he had worn for years. Then Dr. Rosalind Mercer entered from the terrace with Elias Crown and 2 hospital board members. The air around Bennett changed. He saw them, straightened his jacket, and looked across the room until he found me. That was when I understood my seat near the exit had never meant I was supposed to disappear completely. I was supposed to be available when useful. Bennett crossed to me with that public smile of his, the one that asked the room to admire how generous he was being. He touched my elbow and guided me toward the circle near the head table. "Come on, Clara," he murmured. "Don't look so serious." I let him lead me. Not because he had the right. Because this time, I wanted witnesses. Bennett positioned me beside him, the way a magician positions the box before the trick begins. "Dr. Mercer," he said, his voice bright enough to reach the nearest tables, You have to meet my sister, Clara. She works in hospital supplies, keeps the tools clean, right? He laughed first. A few people followed because laughter, in rooms like that, often belongs to whoever seems most confident. Mallory covered her smile with the edge of her champagne flute. My mother stepped closer, eager to soften the insult into something socially acceptable. We love Clara, she said. She's just not the one we brag about. Bennett is our visionary. My father said nothing. I felt Bennett's hand settle on my shoulder, light but possessive, as if even my humiliation needed his direction. I looked at Dr. Rosalind Mercer and waited for the polite smile people usually gave before moving on. It never came. Rosalind set her glass down on the nearest table. Not quickly, not dramatically, just carefully enough that the people around her noticed. Her eyes stayed on my face. Clara Whitcomb, she said. Lakeshore Sterile Safety. Was that you? The circle around us tightened, without anyone moving. Yes, ma'am, I said. Rosalind turned to Bennett. Your pilot proposal uses the same risk tier language from Lakeshore. Did Clara license that protocol to ClearSuture? Bennett's smile flickered. She helped with some early hospital notes. The company built the platform. Rosalind did not blink. Then explain the red tag escalation model. For the first time all evening, Bennett had no sentence ready. He opened his mouth, paused, and glanced at me like I had hidden the answer from him instead of writing it for him 3 years earlier. It's a workflow priority system, he said finally. Our technical people handle the specifics. Clara, Rosalind said, still calm. Who designed it? I heard my mother inhale sharply. I heard a fork touch a plate somewhere behind me. I heard the jazz trio soften as if even they had sensed the room turning. I did, I said. I wrote the original tray tracking protocol, the red tag escalation model, and the audit language Bennett used in his investor materials. He paid me $2,200 on an $18,000 agreement. I was promised co-designer credit. I never assigned ownership to ClearSuture. Bennett's face went red. This is insane. She's making this sound bigger than it was. Rosalind looked at him the way surgeons look at a problem they have already decided how to cut away. This is not family drama, she said. This is patient safety, intellectual property, and misrepresentation. Elias Crown closed the leather folder in his hands. And just like that, Bennett's wedding reception stopped pretending it was only a wedding. What happened after that did not explode. It settled. That was the strange part. No one screamed at first. No one flipped a table or made the kind of scene people later describe with their hands. The damage moved quietly through the room from face to face as people understood what Rosalind had just said. Elias Crown stepped away to make a phone call. One of the hospital board members asked Bennett for the documentation behind ClearSuture's ownership claims. Bennett said he would have his team send it over. His voice cracked on the word team. Elodie stood near the dance floor, still in her wedding dress, looking at her new husband as if someone had handed her a photograph and told her it was evidence. I felt sorry for her, not because she was weak, because she had just learned, in front of everyone. That charm can be a very expensive kind of camouflage. My mother found me near the hallway outside the ballroom 20 minutes later. Her face was pale beneath her makeup, but her voice had sharpened itself back into something familiar. You could have stopped this, she said. I looked at her for a long moment. I did stop something, just not the thing you wanted. My father stood behind her, older somehow, his shoulders rounded inside his suit jacket. Clara, he said quietly. I didn't know. That sentence landed softer than an apology and heavier than an excuse. No, I said. You didn't ask. He closed his eyes. I left before the cake was cut. 2 days later, Mercer Regional Health Network paused ClearSuture's pilot. Elias Crown suspended the investment term sheet. By the end of that week, Bennett had hired an attorney, Elodie had moved back into her mother's guest house, and my mother had sent one message that told me everything I needed to know. You can still fix this if you want to. I wrote back once. I am willing to talk, when you can call my work by its right name. She did not answer. That silence used to break me. This time, it only made the room around me feel bigger. On Monday, I went back to Street Brigid. The sterilizers were running. The carts needed checking. The logs needed review. The work had not become glamorous just because someone powerful had named it correctly. It was still steam, metal, records, and responsibility. It was still mine. June brought me coffee halfway through my shift and leaned against my workstation. "You okay?" she asked. I thought about Bennett's red face, my mother's accusation, my father's closed eyes, Rosalind Mercer's steady voice cutting through a room built to laugh at me. Then I looked at the trays waiting to be cleared. "I think I finally am," I said, because my worth had never depended on whether my family bragged about me. It had been there the whole time, doing its quiet work, steady as a pulse, even when no one upstairs cared to listen.